what climate scientists are concerned about is not just, oh, this is the trajectory by which we're going to go to 2.5 degrees warming by century end, but also, is this going to be, just a slow and steady trend and trajectory, or is there going to be some tipping point?
You are listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to C-Suite Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. I'm Steve Odland from the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series. And in today's discussion, we're going to talk about climate change, but not in the sense that you think. We're going to talk about what do we do if the climate keeps changing and how do we adapt and what happens if we don't. Joining me today is Alex Heil, the senior economist at the Conference Board. Alex, welcome.
Hello, Steve. Pleasure to be with you today.
So, Alex, you and I have talked about all things climate. We've talked about the economic impacts. We've talked about carbon-free 2050. We've talked about plastics. We've talked about, virtually everything you could think of. And at the end of the day, we've got all these activities going on around the world, country by country, some cases more than others. And, we can debate whether it's enough. But at some point, don't we all just kind of have to get used to this and adapt to what's going on?
Yeah, I think, it raises a good point, Steve. So I think where we are now in August of 2024, we've seen roughly a little bit less than 1.5 degrees of warming since the 1850s or so. And if you break this down between sort of natural effects and man-made causes, natural effects could be solar variation, could be volcanoes, can be ozone in the atmosphere. Natural causes are, land use changes, greenhouse gas emissions, and so forth. About, 0.1 degree of the total change is sort of natural, and the rest is associated with greenhouse gas emissions. So if we're looking at this now from the point of view of what's the trajectory, and we've talked about those trajectories numerous times. You mentioned net zero, you mentioned all these, right, these policy-driven scenarios. We're probably, with the current commitments that have been made, we're looking at a future of 2.5 degrees of warming in Celsius, that is, by 2100. So these effects that we're seeing already, they're going to be magnified, and we will likely have to deal with a future in which those impacts and effects are going to be commonplace.
So it's a degree. Let me just make sure I understand, Alex. You've got 1.5 degrees, and again, that's Celsius.
Yes.
That has happened.
A little bit less.
That has happened since 1850. And are you saying between now and 2100, it's another 2.5?
No, it's total warming that gets us to 2.6, just about, of warming. So that's another little bit more than maybe 1.25 degrees Celsius of warming between now and the end of the century.
For a total of 2.6 off of 1850. Okay.
Yeah.
That just doesn't sound like that much, because daily variations in temperature can be, 20 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit, but
No,
that's a big deal for a whole climate.
That's a big deal. That's a very big number. If you look at some of these scenarios that have been projected, that's not the most severe projection that had come out of climate models and so forth, but is certainly one that will bring with it very severe impacts for vast stretches of this planet. And it's important to note that the degree of warming is not uniform across the entire planet Earth. So 20% of the globe already have warmed by more than 2 degrees. And if you look at where most of the warming occurs, in especially some of the cold climates, what climate scientists are concerned about is not just, oh, this is the trajectory by which we're going to go to 2.5 degrees warming by century end, but also, is this going to be, just a slow and steady trend and trajectory, or is there going to be some tipping point embedded in all of this, at which point glaciers melt more rapidly, permafrost thaws more quickly and releases more methane? We had this whole conversation a few weeks ago about methane. And so we understand some of these impacts and how much magnified they can be by sort of rapid climate events. And there's there's much more uncertainty about those, and that's where a lot of the concern nowadays is.
Yeah, but your point about the variability or the variances around the globe is a really important one, because it doesn't hit everybody at the same rate and so forth. And so you've got some people some areas where you really hasn't hit yet, and yet we've talked about it. And so those people are sitting there looking around going, well, if all this is going bad, this is pretty good as far as I'm concerned, because nothing's happening here. And then you have other areas where, wow, and it's particularly desert areas, U.S. Southwest, most of the Middle East, where you're seeing temperatures, around 130 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, it's pushing the boundaries of sustaining life. I mean, so there are real differences, and if we're only 1.5 degrees out of the 2.5 or 2.6 that is projected to happen, we got a long way to go. And so that's why this is something really that people should take seriously, regardless of whether the full impact is happening in their area or not.
That's true. It's also important to differentiate between, how much warming occurs in different, geographies, and also what the related impacts are. Because you mentioned heat, there's this whole issue about rainfall and flooding. There's the severity of storms. There is, and that's, I think, sort of maybe more people are more aware about this. There's sea level rise and what implications that might have. And then there's acidification, ocean acidification, and those kind of effects. And then there are, essentially the sort of second order effects that are going to be affecting economies worldwide. That's climate migration. If you look at some of the large metropolitan areas, especially in the developing world, they might even today be within a couple inches of sea level today. So if the sea level rises by a foot, let's say, we're talking about a global migration pattern that will be initiated as a result of that by people just moving out of the way. So I think it's important to see that there's a lot of we talk about this in terms of CO2 equivalent concentration in the atmosphere. We talk about this about the average global surface temperature rise, but then it's important to differentiate between all these various impacts, and they're not going to be affecting geographies equally around the planet.
Well, Charles Darwin was famous for talking about adaptation and essentially saying the species need to adapt or die. You and I have talked about so many facets of this, and one of our concerns, that we've spoken about is, well, if everybody thinks, all right, by 2050 this is all going to be cured because we'll get to carbon neutrality because everybody's committed to it, whether or not they actually implement it and it happens, but let's just assume it does, then everything will be cured. And you've pointed out many times that no, just by getting there, it doesn't get us back. It just stops the increment. And so it really has struck me in all of these podcasts that we've done. And I would urge our listeners to search and look for these other podcasts because they're all additive. But Alex, even if everybody does everything they said they were going to do and it stops it, we're going to still have a whole lot of change. There's going to be a whole lot of flooding, whole lot of problems, differential climate, and we're going to have to adapt regardless of what happens here.
Yeah, and the whole net zero projection in terms of the future, I think as of right now, if you take all the responses, all the actions, all the policies that have been put forth, they combined don't get us to net zero by 2050. Hence the sort of statement that we may end up at 2.5+ degrees by century end. So there will be a relatively, there will have to be a strong effort of adaptation, of becoming more resilient, of implementing policies and responses that take into account some of these climate impacts. They're not only going to be felt, in different parts of the planet, but also by different stakeholder and population groups that of various backgrounds, various income levels, and you're going to get a whole mosaic of impacts that will have to be managed.
So let's just, we've talked about this in past podcasts, but let's just catalog for our listeners, what humans are doing, sort of around the globe, and what are all the, start with the Paris Accords. What has been passed? What actions are being taken?
Yeah, so as part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Paris Accord basically, put forth goals of how the rate of climate change should be limited to below 2 degrees Celsius warming and ideally closer to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're sort of arriving at the more aggressive benchmark already. And countries have committed to contribution, nationally determined contribution, so called, and it essentially becomes a voluntary system by which every country puts forth how much they are contributing. I mean, this is all a collective action problem, right? We all need to act together, otherwise, we're not going to get there. So these nationally determined contributions, the goal basically that's been identified, that's come out of Paris, which has been communicated, is net zero by 2050. So net zero by 2050, that means that the addition of greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere will be stopped by that point in time. And as a result of that, we're talking about, slowing and stopping some of the rate of climate change. So that's where we are right now. I think, the most recent review of policy actions and contributions put forth by countries worldwide as part of the last annual meeting, as part of the IPCC, has sort of stated that we are falling short as a global community to reach that net zero by 2050 goal. So we are making steps in the right, we as a planetary community, making steps in the right direction, but as of right now, that is still insufficient to hit that sort of identified goalpost of net zero by 2050.
And there are a lot of actions being taken underneath that goal by countries, and just catalog some of those.
Yeah, so there's the global methane pledge. There's the pledge to, triple the amount of renewables. There's a series of additional benchmarks and metrics in various parts in various industries, and companies have followed suit by adopting, net zero sustainability standards by future points in time. Many follow this sort of 2050 trajectory. And so if we're talking about this, there's different standards when it comes to plastic pollution, how much that should be reversed. There's food waste that's related to methane emissions. There are certain countries that have become very proactive in managing some of the food waste issues, and how much that's contributing to climate change. There's, just to if you just run down in the transportation sector, there's a general understanding that transportation is going to be electrified. Countries have, put out mandates by when their respective automotive industries should be selling, 100% electrified vehicles only. So we have this big long list of benchmarks, and they all roll up to this framework essentially that countries follow and have, in a sense, adopted, which is the net zero by 2050 pledge.
You've also talked about all of this still, not getting us back, and so therefore there needs to be huge investments in sequestration. You might want to just summarize that as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you go back, let's say a decade or so, without putting out too fine a point on that, I, the whole conversation about carbon removal, in particular direct air capture of CO2 emissions, or of CO2 in the atmosphere rather, that was really in its infancy. That was sort of seen as, oh, one shouldn't be doing this because, in a sense, it's cheating, right? The way to actually receive a certain climate goal is by reducing emissions first. And that carbon removal, in a sense, is a shortcut, if you will. And that's true. You should be addressing, emissions reductions first. But over the last decade or so, it's become now part of the mainstream. I mean, all the projections now take into consideration that there will be a significant volume, a significant amount of carbon removal by 2050, by 2100. And without that, it is going to be increasingly difficult to achieve some of those stated goals. So we have now these pilot plants, in Iceland or Southern California that are now starting to suck CO2 essentially directly out of the air. That's a costly endeavor that still is around $1,000 a ton right now. The industry suggests that that's going to be competitive and more cost effective once costs have fallen, cost per ton removed to about $100. But we're still a pretty long way away from making that a less costly alternative and also adopting that at scale. Now, in just sequestration terms, for instance, the oil and gas sector has for decades, essentially sequestered CO2 from some of their operations, is then reutilized in other processes. So some of that technology does exist, but it's also much easier to capture and sequester CO2 directly from a smokestack from an industrial facility than it is to just doing that out of ambient air.
We're talking with Dr. Alex Heil about climate change. We're going to take a short break and be right back.
What does the future of work mean for your employees? How will your company navigate ESG? Will there be a global recession? At the Conference Board, our experts translate the latest research and economic analysis into insights and real-time problem solving for your organization. Membership at the Conference Board provides your team with an assortment of knowledge, from economics, marketing and communications, ESG, public policy, and human capital. As a member, you'll have access to our center experts, member-exclusive events, data and benchmarking tools, and peer sharing that will help you understand the present and shape the future. Consider becoming a Conference Board member today by visiting www.conference-board.org.
Welcome back to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland from the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Dr. Alex Heil, a senior economist here at the Conference Board. Okay, so Alex, if we go back to where we ended the first half before the break, we were talking about sequestration as one of the tools, but essentially there are a long list of tools being deployed to decrease the amount of emissions. There are also these tools to try to address, proactively reduce the carbon. Nevertheless, all of these efforts today still don't add up to enough change in order to then reduce the temperature around the climate. And so therefore, there is no plan that works that gets us back to what we would have considered normal, baseline 1850. And hence, there's still going to be all these repercussions. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. If you look at the United States and the emissions profile and trend over time, the US has been successful in reducing emissions by anywhere around 17, 18% in total since 2005. A lot of that has happened in the energy sector. Substitution of natural gas for coal is one story, electrification of certain other sectors. This is the early part of the electrification of transport trend has played a role in this. But even so, by 2024, 20 years later, the reduction and the pace of reduction is not, swift enough to really point towards that 2050 target point. So we'll have to come up with other strategies. There is certainly research going on into energy forms that might be really groundbreaking, into other technologies that would have immediate, much more dramatic impacts in reversing some of these trends. But short of achieving those, we really need to think about how we're going to adapt to some of these damages that are already here and that are sure to get worse over the next few decades.
And this again goes back to what Charles Darwin said: the species, in order for the species to survive, there needs to be these changes. And if you look at anthropology, or if you look at various changes that the Earth has undergone over time, it's clear there have been massive climate changes in the history of the planet. Now, the history of the planet is far longer than the history of mankind, and so some of this happened before mankind, some of it after. But if you dig down 2 miles below the Greenland ice sheet, 2 miles of ice, there are plants, there's remnants of plants and ferns and so forth. Underneath the North Pole, same thing. So at one time, the planet was far warmer than it is today, and these ice caps and glaciers didn't exist. Now, what were the ramification of that on the species as the planet was going through that? What was the ramification when it cooled again, and so forth? Is in the fossil record, and it has been pretty traumatic. And so it is required that we think through, not only the human species, but all the species of life on Earth, and what do we do to help all the species adapt?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, I think records exist. They go down. If you look over, scientists have sort of, assessed the last 800,000 years, and CO2 concentration have varied anywhere between 170 and 300. We're now at 420 parts per million. So we've sort of broken out of that range, but it's true that this doesn't affect humans only. This is a natural environment kind of a change that that we're currently observing, and certainly something that, adaptation is going to play a key role here going forward.
So what is your advice for people? I mean, we recorded a podcast that our listeners can source on flooding, and what's going to happen to the coastal areas and so forth. What's your advice, for instance, to deal with the rising oceans and the potential flooding that can happen?
Yeah, I think we discussed in our last podcast, that flooding is not only, a coastal phenomenon, but it happens inland as well. So this is I think it's important for businesses and, households and governments to realize that just because there might be somewhere in the inner parts of the United States or other parts of the world, that flooding is still an issue. And we've seen that over the last few years with flooding of rivers and flooding as a result of rainfall. I think, ultimately everybody has to go through a risk assessment in terms of how some of these climate impacts are affecting them going forward. And for some, stakeholders, it might be a flooding related issue. For others, it might be they live in a zone that has been dramatically affected by fire. There are certainly others, and we're seeing this in part of the American West right now with some of these heat effects where it doesn't even cool down anymore, um, below 100 degrees even overnight Fahrenheit. So I think there's risk in all of these, and there's the ones that are dramatic, short-term and intense heat, fire, dramatic floods fall into this. And then there are the ones that are maybe more gradual, and they will affect stakeholders over time, and sea level rise falls into that category. So I think everybody who anticipates being affected, and that's going to be the vast majority of people on this planet, you really have to go through a risk assessment and see how your own personal or professional operations are affected by any of these impacts.
Yeah, I think you're taking a very measured approach, and rightly so, in that the effects are not like spreading peanut butter. It will everybody's going to get hit differently, and the effects are going to be different. So you have to figure out what those are going to be. But I think your point is it's important that you deliberately think through this. And a lot of people go, well, 2050 is a long time. I won't be here then, or maybe they will, maybe they won't. Who knows? Or that's not my problem. That's the next generation's problem. Or that's not my, I can't do anything about it. That's the government's problem. I think what you're saying, what I hear you saying in all of our conversations is now you really need to think about it now, right now. And you need to think about it as it relates individuals. Do you buy a house that's sitting in a flood prone area and then deal with it when the flood happens? Why do you want to do that? So think about where that is from a business standpoint. Where do you locate your businesses? What are where will people be? Are people going to, and then you talked about migration. Will people migrate, further north and further south? And then will there be this uninhabitable band around the middle. I mean, these are the kinds of things that you've described.
That's very true. And there's this distinction between, what can I do now to basically lower my own, climate changing emissions, if you will. What can I do in terms of my household with more efficient equipment, more insulation, lower the carbon footprint of how I conduct my day-to-day life? That's one side. And then the other side is, if there are these impacts and they're already starting and they have started for years and people are becoming much more aware of them, then yeah, I think people need to look at this and say, living in a flood zone, not a good idea, clearly. And the repeated occurrence of some of these floods are telling a story. And that's, from an economy-wide perspective, that's raising costs, but it's devastating households, it's devastating individuals. So we need to, individuals need to be aware of this, and they need to be aware of not making decisions that are truly reflective of some of these climate impacts. And it's not a question of panicking. It's not a question of saying, oh, I need to pack up this afternoon and get out of here. But it's much more important to just say, look, there are some parts of the country that are going to be affected by heat, much more so than others. And those probably in the long term are, they probably will be having to be avoided. I think these sort of terms of managed retreat, where one settles, where people live, what should be really supported with policy, that's going to be very important in order to reduce some of these impacts, either for society overall or certainly individually.
And for people who don't think this is really that serious, just last year, 2023, 47,000 Europeans died from heat-related causes just due to the climate change there, and that's not the hottest place on earth. So there does need to be some adaptation. What's the role of the private sector versus the public sector in that?
Well, I think the private sector is going to look at this from the point of view of the customers, the markets. They're going to be affected, where people are living, what kind of services and products they will be desiring, certainly, and also their own operations in terms of their supply chains. I think there's going to be much more risk embedded in supply chains when it comes to climate impacts, and that's, flooding, storms, fire. They can all affect not just the utility sector or not just the local manufacturing plant that gets inundated by high waters, but this is something that is going to affect businesses across countries, across the world, multinationals as well as small businesses. These impacts, the private sector is going to have to look at this in terms of, we need to plan, we need to designate resources, financial resources, as well as making sure that our workforce is going to be taken care of in cases where climate impacts are, affecting workers and laborers and so forth. And I think that's all becoming, a function of making decisions that are aware of some of these changes, and also some of the timing of these changes. This is not a problem that's going to occur in a generation from now, but that's something that needs to be built in now. And government certainly has a role in terms of this. I think there's an important point to look at infrastructure, making infrastructure more resilient, building in places and adding infrastructure so that, for instance, the transition to renewables can be accomplished, as much as some of that transmission infrastructure, for instance, is public and not private. But there's certainly also urban areas in terms of transportation, in terms of utilities, in terms of tunnels, bridges, airports, and so forth. There's going to be a lot of impact that those infrastructure items will be exposed to, and government plays a key role in placing those when there are decisions to be made away from some of these risks as much as that's possible.
All right, Alex Heil, thanks for joining us today and talking about how humans and other species need to adapt.
Thanks so much for having me, Steve.
And thanks to all of you for listening in to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm Steve Odland, and this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.